After the discharge of nuclear wastewater, I was torn apart by a strange fish upon rebirth. I discovered that my eyes could detect the level of nuclear contamination. Thus, I began assessing the safety of the land and water, determining the fate of people's lives. I tested the soil, rebuilt homes, and saved the people from the abyss. Everyone said the reborn little fisherwoman was a savior. I was killed by a fish with 4 legs, or perhaps calling it a monster would be more accurate. As a fisherwoman, I grew up by the sea, accustomed to all kinds of fish, shrimp, shells, and crabs. But this creature with sharp teeth, bulging eyes for legs, and a long tail fin was unlike anything I had ever seen. It wasn't surprising, though, since the neon country discharged nuclear wastewater into the ocean. Coastal areas worldwide had turned into hell on Earth. Various terrifying, distorted, and mutated fish had crawled out from the deep sea, leaving destruction in their wake, with corpses scattered everywhere, and not a single blade of grass surviving. At that moment, my soul hovered in the air, watching my body being shredded by that monstrous fish, its teeth grinding my bones into mush and swallowing me whole. The sound of it chewing was enough to send chills down your spine. It reminded me of the sound my rabbit made when it chewed carrots. But that rabbit had died the day after the nuclear wastewater was discharged, coughing up blood in the grass, just like me. Now it was humanity's catastrophe, and no one could escape. I felt my soul being torn apart, and with the last bit of my consciousness, I closed my eyes. I didn't expect to be reborn. The pain of being torn apart seemed not to have fully dissipated. Dazed, I woke up in bed and opened my eyes. Perhaps it was a side effect, but everything around me had a faint green border. Later, I realized that the color of the border indicated the level of nuclear radiation. I rubbed my eyes and glanced at the time on my phone. Instantly waking up, there were still 7 days left until the neon country discharged nuclear wastewater. On August 24th of my previous life, the neon country announced it would discharge nuclear wastewater into the ocean. That afternoon, large groups of dolphins and whales washed ashore. Near my home, they were stranded children who lived by the sea, were excited, running to see this rare spectacle. But as I watched, a sense of foreboding began to rise within me. These marine creatures are extremely sensitive to water quality and have high standards for it. The fact that so many of them were stranded on the beach seemed like they were fleeing something from the ocean. In the evening, the fishermen gathered their nets to head home, having had a bountiful catch, but their expressions were not as joyous as usual. Instead, they were all frowning, deeply troubled. They had noticed that the fish they caught that day were lethargic, as though sick. The next morning, I went to the shallow sea farming area near my home and found a horseshoe crab. Now, horseshoe crabs, CBS, typically live in shallow waters at depths of 20 to 60 m, preferring sandy bottoms and burrowing into the sand. They would never appear in a shallow farming area. My heart sank, and I immediately sensed something was wrong. By the 3rd day, it was confirmed the discharge of nuclear wastewater from the neon country had severely polluted the water resources along our coast. My dog drank seal water by mistake, and within half an hour, it began convulsing and foaming at the mouth. I hurried it to the pet hospital, but before we even entered, the vet waved his hand in helpless resignation. Go back, there's nothing we can do. There have already been over 20 cases today. The doctor looked grim as he quickly packed his things, hunger closed for the day sign, and left the hospital. I carried my dying dog home. But as I passed the beach, a terrible stench hit me. The sultry weather made the smell almost suffocating. What was even more terrifying was that I could faintly hear the sound of explosions. Could this be the giant apparition phenomenon? The beach was covered in massive bodies of marine creatures, almost completely enveloped in a sickly green rotting gas. I fought the overwhelming nausea as I rushed home. Upon entering, I saw my parents sighing deeply, their eyes slightly red. It turned out that all the fish in our shallow sea farming area had died in just a few days. No one could explain clearly whether the corpses of the stranded marine animals had released superbacteria, or if the nuclear wastewater from the neon country had spread at an unimaginable speed. Any case, the seaside was no longer livable. In less than a week, the chickens, ducks, and livestock in the coastal cities were nearly wiped out, and in the neighboring areas of the coastal cities, half of the poultry and livestock had already died or been severely injured at the same time. The panic and crisis had spread to humanity. Unheard of strange diseases appeared one after another, with various physical issues emerging continuously. The underground water had been contaminated. Humans seemed to be choked by invisible, ghostly hands. Facing death at any moment, my parents and I quickly packed our things and returned to our old village. But upon entering the village, We were stunned. Most of the villagers had already left. Even the elderly over 80 years old were trembling as they packed their bags preparing to flee. Upon asking, we learned that not only had all the poultry and livestock died, but even the crops and vegetables were starting to wither, and the fruits on the trees, before they could even ripen, had already rotted and fallen. Off everyone was heading inland. However, nuclear contamination had seeped through the water supply, and it was everywhere. Even inland areas wouldn't be safe. It was just a matter of time. The government was helpless in the face of this. The pile of marine animal carcasses on the beach emitted a foul stench. Growing more and more food became increasingly scarce, yet bizarre and strange diseases continued to spread. People were fighting desperately for water and food, with a bottle of Enfu Spring being sold for hundreds of yuan. The supermarket in town was looted. Clean and apart from seafood, everything edible was snatched away. Some people even fought over drinking water and food. This world had gone mad. Despite this, my parents and I decided to stay in the village because we had nowhere else to go. We had always gone out to sea to catch fresh fish and shrimp, so we never had the habit of stocking up on food. When we hurriedly moved into the village, we only brought some dried fish and shrimp. Within less than a week, we couldn't hold on anymore, and we had to go to the shallow sea to gather some still breathing fish to fill our stomachs. But this life didn't last long. I was torn apart by a strange fish monster with 4 legs, its bite cleanly devouring me. However, I never expected that I would be reborn at this moment. It was summer, and the beach was bustling with people. No one knew that in 7 days this place would become a hell on earth. Recalling the horrors of my previous life, I desperately wanted to do something, but in the end I returned dejected. Even the government was powerless, and as a small fisherwoman with little influence, what could I do? This was humanity's disaster, and even if I was reborn, I had no certainty that I would survive until the crisis was over. I could only do my best to struggle and survive. I quickly went home and told my parents that I had been reborn, and that the apocalypse would come in 7 days. I urged them to dispose of the fish in the shallow sea farming area as soon as possible, store up food, and leave the coast. My mother, like a TV drama, came over to feel my forehead and suggested I see a psychologist. I was extremely anxious and didn't know how to explain. It was my father, however, who put out his cigarette and with a serious expression showed me his phone screen. Sweetheart, are you talking about this? I looked at the phone, which had a green border around it, and the screen displayed the announcement about the Neon country's nuclear wastewater charge schedule. Having lived by the sea for most of his life, my father understood how crucial water quality was for marine life and fishermen. He often kept up with international news and had been worried about the wastewater issue in the past, but he never imagined the consequences would be so catastrophic. Dad, I know this sounds absurd, but it's all true. Once the nuclear wastewater is discharged, all the marine life will die. The underground water will be contaminated, and we will either starve to death, die of thirst, or get sick from eating contaminated food. That I was torn apart by a strange fish. Perhaps my serious tone forced my father to take me seriously, or maybe he had already sensed the impending crisis himself. In any case, although my mother still didn't understand, she listened to my father and me. We quickly sold off the fish, shrimp, crabs and shellfish in our allow sea farming area at low prices. Then we purchased a large amount of compressed food, canned goods, various medicines and daily necessities, as well as plenty of clean water. Our little truck, which we usually use to deliver seafood to other cities, was now packed full of these essential supplies. We were preparing to leave to return to the old village, though still in a coastal area. At least, it wasn't right next to the sea. I never wanted to see the horrifying scene of dead fish everywhere again. Before leaving, we stood on the beach one last time, gazing at the ocean. We had known all our lives, feeling a mix of emotions. What surprised me more was that ever since I had been reborn, everything I looked at had a green border around it. But now, as I looked out toward the deep sea, I faintly noticed some orange-yellow light moving. I dived into the water to swim forward, barely able to make out the orange-yellow glow. It was the border around the fish in the sea. At first, I thought it might be glaucoma or an infection from the green pus bacteria. But after seeing a doctor, they assured me everything was normal. Since I didn't feel unwell, I assumed it was just a side effect of my rebirth. But now it seemed more complicated than that. Why were the same fish species surrounded by green borders sometimes and yellow ones at other times? I didn't have time to investigate further. With 2 days left until the discharge of the nuclear wastewater, we had finally finished our preparations and were ready to drive away. A few days ago, my father called all our relatives and friends gently advising them to leave the coast. Unfortunately, it had little effect. I also posted some prophecies on social media. I am reborn, please. Stock up on purified water and food. Stay away from the coast. After the 24th, and don't eat seafood. As soon as I posted this, hundreds and thousands of replies flooded in, almost crashing my phone. Some people accused me of scaremongering, while others expressed fear and trembling. There were also those who dug up my identity as a fisherwoman, insisting I was trying to hype up seafood sales. I didn't explain, and there was no way to explain. With this faster approaching, any person I could save would be a blessing. We arrived back at the village around midnight. We quickly tidied up, storing supplies and purified water in the cellar at my insistence. After unloading the supplies, my father drove the truck out of the village. The dilapidated wall and rusty gate remained unchanged. No one knew that this rundown house at the edge of the village was the only shelter for the three of us. In my previous life, I had seen the terrifying and greedy side of human nature. In the face of life and death at this point, excessive kindness could only lead to one's own death. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and with a wet summer too. Peach trees had borne an abundance of fruit, each surrounded by a faint green light. I thought about how soon the contaminated seawater would turn into clouds and rain, poisoning all the plants, and my heart itched. I had hoped that in this life I could take the dog with me, and at least it would live a little longer. But to my surprise, even though it was far from the seawater, the dog still died on the third day. After the nuclear wastewater was discharged, its small corpse lay under the peach tree, still foaming. Mouse, unlike in the previous life, this time it was surrounded by a pale yellow border, and its mouth was stained with some orange-yellow fish meat. That's when I noticed that scattered around the yard were chunks of fish, all surrounded by orange-yellow borders. I was hesitating when my father came out and frowned as he looked at the scene. What's going on? Is this fish toxic? He sighed, bent down, and reached to pick up the little dog. In that instant, my mind went into overdrive, and I seemed to have figured something out. Dad, don't touch it. It could be nuclear contamination. My father froze, staring at me in shock. I didn't have much certainty, and I had no evidence. The reason for my suspicion was purely because of my father's words. Toxic. After all, in my previous life, my dog died from being exposed to contaminated seawater, and now the only poison could be nuclear contamination. Perhaps the green border around things in my sight represented things that had not been contaminated, while the orange-yellow indicated those that had. It sounded absurd, but I had already experienced rebirth. What else could be impossible? But how could the contamination have spread so quickly to the village? The nuclear wastewater had only been discharged for 3 days. As my father and I exchanged glances, suddenly we heard a commotion from the village, the sounds of barking dogs mixed with indistinct shouting growing louder. Gradually, the noise got closer. You heartless bastard, you don't even have money to offer sacrifices to your ancestors. What kind of poison did you put in the seafood? My grandmother is vomiting blood and unconscious. There were a few men shouting angrily with sounds of scuffling and struggling in the background. I quietly climbed up the wall of the yard, using the dense branches and leaves to shield myself, and cautiously peered out. Several men of different ages were fiercely tearing at a middle-aged man, their faces full of hostility. Not far away there was a small truck, parked on the village road, with daily seafood written on the side. On the ground there were many dead fish and shrimp, their bodies lifeless, emitting an orange-yellow glow, occasionally twitching. It wasn't just the fish, both the truck and the middle-aged man were surrounded by an orange-yellow border. In the chaos, the man curled up, covering his head, almost breaking down. I really didn't know it would turn out like this. The beach is full of dead fish. I've spent years raising these fish. I just wanted to sell them off cheaply. Before I fled, I didn't poison them, really didn't. I silently returned to the yard, my heart heavy with mixed emotions. My father, upon hearing this, also looked pained. As fellow fishermen, we understood his helplessness and despair. However, I grabbed my father, who was about to go outside to mediate, and stopped him. Dad, those fish are surrounded by orange-yellow light. The nuclear contamination has already been brought into the village by this man. We can't have any more contact with the villagers. At that moment, my mother rushed out of the house, her expression anxious. Isn't that the voice of your second cousin? Hurry, go. Tell him to hide. He's a good son. He even went to school with me. When we were kids, I knew my mother was always kind and nostalgic. But now it was no longer the time to warn others. Mom, don't go. I don't know which one is your second cousin, but those men, their bodies have turned yellow. If the color really represented the extent of nuclear contamination, they should be close to death. I didn't continue speaking, as my mother had already tightly grasped my wrist, that night to get to the bottom of things. I quietly left the house with my father. The night was deep, and everywhere I looked there were specks of green and yellow light. The closer we got to the village's edge, the more intense the yellow became. "That's your second cousin's house." My father pointed to a brightly lit house from a distance. It was the dead of night, and everything was eerily silent at this hour. The house was still brightly lit. Was it possible? Sure enough, when we were about 100 steps away, we heard crying coming from inside. The grandmother, who had been unconscious, had already passed away. Soon the door opened. They had actually taken the old woman's body out in the middle of the night and laid it out in the mortuary. I couldn't clearly see the body, but there was a thick orange-red glow surrounding it. This was the darkest border I had seen so far in the darkness. The color stood out starkly, making my heart race to verify my suspicions. I casually brought home a cage with a white rabbit that still had a greenish glow. I fed them food with different colored halos. Sure enough, the rabbit that ate the food with the green glow was fine. The one that ate the food with the yellow glow was still alive, but barely, and the one that ate the food with the deeper orange glow started coughing up blood by the next morning and died. Seeing the results, my parents and I were all taken aback, and without a word quietly disposed of the dead rabbit. Soon the village was filled with wailing families who had bought seafood at low prices. One after another faced misfortune, but now they understood it wasn't a matter of spoiled seafood. It was nuclear contamination that had already seeped in. The news broadcasts were covering the real-time situation every day, just like in my previous life. Within a week, the coastal cities had already fallen. The beaches were littered with the corpses of sea creatures, emitting a stench under the scorching sun. Food was being hoarded, water sources were scarce, and everyone was in a state of panic, not knowing if they would survive the next day. People died on being torn apart by strange fish from radiation sickness, caused by contaminated food, from mysterious illnesses, or from hunger and thirst. It was nearly the middle of July, and the elders said that the gates of hell had opened, and the king of hell was coming for the souls. The country had never experienced such a disaster. The whole nation was in fear, and cries of sorrow filled the air. At this point, my parents sighed deeply, finally fully believing that I had truly been reborn. "Sweetheart, you said you died last time because of those strange fish. This time we have nothing to fear. As long as the three of us are together, we'll definitely make it through. The supplies and the cellar will be enough to get us through. You also have a special ability to detect contamination. Even if the supplies run out, we can find more. The country will definitely come to our rescue." I nodded with a forced smile, though my heart was heavy. Yes, the country would definitely come to save us, but this time it was a national disaster, a catastrophe for all of humanity. I looked around at the yellow and green borders and knew that I couldn't hide any longer. The country needed my eyes, and my fellow countrymen needed them too. That night, after my parents had gone to sleep, I left a letter and quietly left the village. I didn't know when this calamity would end, but I hoped the supplies and the cellar would be enough to sustain my parents until that day. As for me, I had more important things to do. The moon was still and quiet. The autumn cuckoos chirping. I carried some food and water and walked toward the outskirts of the village, preparing to hand myself over to the police station. I was so preoccupied with my thoughts that I didn't notice that the gate to the yard had quietly cracked open behind me. My father's worried eyes were fixed on my back as he sighed deeply. Although I had known it for a while, when I walked out of the secluded village and saw the outside world again, my heart was still shaken. The streets, once bustling with traffic, were now cold and chaotic. There were few pedestrians, but plenty of debris, trash and rotting food, glowing with yellow light, giving off a nauseating stench. The doors to several supermarkets had been smashed, and inside it was a scene of devastation with empty shelves. As I passed the seafood market, a foul green mist hung in the air, with piles of rotting fish and shrimp stacked high everywhere I looked. There were orange-yellow halos, and I could vaguely see human bodies mixed in, left uncollected. Water wasn't scarce, but when I turned on a faucet, the water that came out was surrounded by a dark red halo, looking almost like blood, disturbing to the eye. The groundwater had been fully contaminated, and after a single rain, all the flowers and trees in the town seemed to lose their vitality and quickly withered. By the time I reached the police station, I was already in tears. When I explained my intentions, the officer who received me had a complicated expression. I knew my words were hard to believe, and at this critical moment they were merciful not to have me locked up as a lunatic. I was restless and anxious to prove myself. My eyes darted around, and I rushed straight for a pile of fruit that had been left outside the door earlier, while I had been waiting in line outside. I saw a young man dragging an older man in farmer clothes, accusing him of selling poisoned fruit his wife had eaten some, and dyed the pile of a fruit was yellow and green, so I picked one that had a green glow and took a bite several. Police. Officers rushed forward to stop me, but I had already taken a large bite. It's fine, this apple is safe, I said, chewing. I then picked another apple with a red glow. This one is severely contaminated, probably enough to kill you with one bite. I took a few more bites of the apple. Still unharmed, the officers, half convinced, fed the red glowing apple to a bird. Sure enough, within 2 minutes the bird collapsed and died half an hour later after I had been registered. I was quickly transporting by police car. The relevant department on the way, a group of medical doctors from the research institute, had already been alerted. They took me for a thorough checkup, focusing on my eyes and brain. They also showed me various samples with nuclear radiation. Although I couldn't give exact numbers, I could recognize the green, yellow, orange, and red halos, which represented different levels of contamination: uncontaminated, lightly contaminated, moderately contaminated, and severely contaminated. After numerous tests, the experts were finally convinced that I truly possessed this extraordinary ability that couldn't be explained by science. Originally, nuclear contamination testing was an expensive task in many aspects. To inspect the land and water resources along the coast and identify areas that were still suitable for cultivation or use was a massive undertaking. But now everything had become much easier. After calling my parents to reassure them, I put on a radiation suit with the professionals and began surveying every piece of land and water in the coastal area for contamination. When I returned to the beach, I realized that the once clear and vibrant blue sea had almost turned completely black. Piles of decaying corpses, swollen and bloated, lay on the sand, covered with flies and maggots. Blood everywhere. The whole area was shrouded in a red glow. The beach under my feet felt soft and wet. A gooey green slime mixed with sand, and a few wriggling maggots had already crawled up to my feet. I staggered backward only to bump into something behind me and almost tripped. Turning around, I saw a massive fish carcass. Its skin was rotting, bones jutting out, and sharp, jagged teeth gleamed menacingly. I glanced down, and my heart nearly stopped. It was a four-legged fish. In my previous life, I had died at the jaws of this kind of fish. Although I had the protective suit on which blocked out the smell, the scent still made my stomach churn and filled me with dread. Let go, this area is severely polluted. I forced out the words while suppressing the nausea, quickly leaving the beach. The coastal area was beyond saving. For the next few days, we gave up on the seaside and shifted our focus to nearby mountain villages, searching for land suitable for farming and locating sources of drinkable water and food. Preparing for reconstruction, the field hospitals set up during the pandemic had been repurposed as temporary shelters for those fleeing the coastal areas. To avoid chaos, everyone coming to seek refuge had to undergo a health check to ensure they weren't carrying any contagious diseases. Most importantly, those heavily contaminated by radiation were not allowed in. Thus, I became the last line of manual security. Sitting on a chair, I closely observed the people moving through the line. From our experiments, we had concluded that lightly contaminated humans or food were still survivable or edible. However, those with moderate contamination could be at risk of sudden death, and those severely contaminated would typically die within 24 hours. To ensure the safety of the majority, I had no choice but to strictly follow the standard and deny entry to anyone with an orange-red glow. You can't stop us from coming in. Who says I'm severely contaminated? Where are the testing devices? I'm fine, please, let me in. My child is in there. He's only 10 months old. He can't live without his mother. Angry protests and heartbreaking pleas echoed my ears, and sometimes emotional people even tried to rush toward me to strike. If not for the 2 soldiers with guns standing nearby, I feared I might have been mobbed and beaten to death by those panicking people. To avoid public backlash and also to protect my safety, the fact that I had special abilities was kept a secret. But there's no such thing as a completely airtight secret. The prophecy I had made earlier was still trending, and someone had dug up my identity as a fisherman's daughter. However, everyone was focused on survival, so no one delved too deep into it. Now, I frequently appeared in public, and most importantly, each time I was surrounded by several esteemed experts. They were scientists with impressive credentials listed on Bayou Encyclopedia, and I, just an ordinary 20-some girl, had the ability to determine the safety of water and soil, and to decide life or death with a single sentence. It was hard not to attract attention, despite my caution. Some workers had leaked photos of me at work. My personal was quickly dug up, and my previous prophecy and recent activities were all connected, leading to various speculations amid concerns and debates about national issues. I unexpectedly trended on social media. The headline was, "Eye-catching #reborn Fisher girl suspected to be the savior hashtag." The overwhelming comments caused social media to crash. When the platform finally recovered all information about me had been wiped clean, the government had sent special police to protect my safety. There were still many regions waiting for me to inspect. The situation along the coastline was worsening, with shallow waters and nearly covered in the bodies of marine creatures. The seawater had turned black and various infectious diseases had started spreading. I moved tirelessly between several coastal cities, looking for places suitable for rebuilding and habitation. Fortunately, China is vast, and there are still large areas of land in relatively remote, sparsely populated regions that could be developed for farming. Nearby wells, though slightly contaminated, could still be purified for safe use, at least to ensure basic survival. Public officials were the first to engage in long-term reconstruction efforts, while volunteers from inland areas kept coming one after another. This was a national disaster, and water resources were being recycled. No one could guarantee that inland areas would always have abundant food and water, so most cities, unlike during past earthquakes or floods, couldn't just donate food supplies carelessly. They had to send manpower to help with rebuilding, land reclamation, farming. Sowing inexperienced volunteers, under the guidance of elderly farmers, chose the most suitable vegetables for the season. Wherever we went, all edible fruits and vegetables were marked, managed, harvested, and processed into food, distributed to various shelters. 2 weeks later, the first batch of people who had died from severe nuclear contamination had been properly handled. The hospitals were filled to capacity with patients suffering from severe contamination or rare illnesses. Some barely survived, while others died in agony, some even resorting to suicide. Fortunately, I was able to separate the contaminated zones, find safe areas, and control food and water supplies. The coastal residents were relocated to temporary safe places, and the death toll from radiation pollution was largely controlled. The fish carcasses piling up on the beach were also processed and destroyed in batches, reducing the spread of infectious diseases at the source. Meanwhile, strategies for purifying water sources had already been set in motion. The relevant departments were working tirelessly, starting with safeguarding the existing drinking water and gradually progressing to purifying lightly contaminated water. As for the vast sea that had turned black, there was no way to purify the nuclear contaminated seawater for now other than to intercept and protect freshwater. The cleanup of the bodies on the beach continued in waves. Humanity was struggling to survive, let alone marine life. Society was gradually returning to order. Volunteers continued to stay behind, helping coastal fishermen rebuild their homes. During this time, I was mentally and physically drained. I lost 10 pounds, and dark circles appeared under my eyes, but the newly reclaimed lands had begun sprouting vegetables. The temporary shelters were no longer filled with whaling, and although the coastal areas were sealed off, the fishermen had found refuge and were no longer homeless. Finally, I could take a short break after overworking my eyes. They became inflamed, bloodshot, dry and itchy. But I couldn't risk using medication, though it might sound funny. This special ability I had with my eyes was mysterious and unpredictable. What if using medicine caused it to disappear? So I could only endure the discomfort, closing my eyes to rest whenever possible and applying a warm compress when needed. I had held on for so long, and finally I had a chance to rest for half a day and get a good sleep. But before I could fall asleep, I was suddenly awakened by the urgent ringing of my phone. "If you want to save your father's life, bring $1 million. I was still groggy, my mind unclear, and for a moment I thought I was dreaming, but the next second a weak but familiar voice came through. "Baby, this is a madman, don't mind him. Call the police." It was my father's voice, however. Before he could finish speaking, there was a grunt, and then he fell silent. "If you dare to call the police, I'll kill him." At that moment, I fully woke up. My father had been kidnapped. Stow, playing dumb. "I know you're that savior from the internet. You must have been rewarded handsomely by the government, right? Let's see if you're willing to pay to save your father's life." The kidnapper's voice grew more arrogant, mocking me, urging me to respond. "It's just money. What's the big deal? I'll give you $2 million, but only if my dad is unharmed. Otherwise, I won't call the police, that would be too easy for you. I'll personally throw you into the sea to feed the fish. You've done enough research, you should know which areas are most severely polluted. With just a glance, I forced myself to suppress my anxiety. In unease cleared my throat, and tried to sound as commanding as possible for the next, while I slowed my speech and stretched out the conversation time, asking for the drop. Off location, I was dying to see who had the audacity and stupidity to kidnap my father at this critical moment. The government and police were busy, but they weren't off duty. The kidnapper was cautious to the point of being frustrating, listing 10 locations, demanding that I leave 20,000 at each spot. Do you understand? I could even hear his tone of glee and excitement. Too many. I can't remember all that. I responded coldly. Worthless, he snapped. You still want your dad, do you? Still want your money, I shot back. There was a long silence on the other end before he reluctantly relented and changed the location to South Village, asking to meet in 3 days after hanging up. I looked up. Can we lock down his location? Now we can get a rough estimate, but it's not precise. It's not advisable to alert him. The police officer in front of me confirmed with headquarters and replied solemnly, yes. Once I figured out it was a kidnapping scam, I immediately pressed the emergency alarm. After all, I had contributed to the country in a special way, and with my unique abilities plus the huge media attention I had caused online, how could there be no protection? Let's wait for the handover. Then I nodded, trying to reassure myself, at least for these few days, my father should be safe. I lay back in bed, but sleep eluded me as regret gnawed at my insides. Before, I thought being in the public eye and having offended so many because of the shelter would put pressure on my parents if I brought them here. I had hoped they would be safe in the old house with enough supplies and wait for my return, but I never imagined my father would be kidnapped. The last few days had been so busy that I hadn't noticed my father hadn't sent me a message for 3 days. With unease, I endured the next 3 days. Arriving at the designated location, half an hour early, hidden under my collar, was a tiny communicator allowing me to stay in contact with the police on the scene. Because of my special abilities, the authorities were closely monitoring this kidnapping case, and elite police forces had already surrounded South Village, but I didn't expect that the person coming for the ransom would be my mother. I froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. The plan was to arrest the person coming for the money. But now, where's the money? Did you bring it? My mother asked coldly, as if she didn't recognize me. She radiated a faint yellow hue, clearly showing signs of mild contamination. In her jacket pocket, there was a mobile phone with a faintly glowing screen. It seemed that my mother was being monitored, or Eve's dropped on, and the kidnapper didn't know we were mother and daughter. My worry intensified, not knowing what had happened in the past few days. But my mother just kept urging for the ransom verification. I hesitated and opened the box beside me, revealing stacks of cash. Where's my dad? He's not dead. Give me the money, and he'll come to the police station on his own. Otherwise, he'll go back to where he came from. As she spoke, my mother moved closer and reached out for the box of money. Our eyes met, and for a moment I hesitated, then decided to take a gamble. In a flash, handcuffs dropped from my sleeve, locking onto my mother's wrist. This was a technique I had practiced for 3 days and nights, but unfortunately that bastard didn't show up in person. As she was escorted into the police car, I saw my mother let out a sigh of relief, and I felt a little at ease. It seemed I hadn't made a mistake. I quickly called the kidnapper back, taking the initiative and scolding him for not keeping his word. Aren't you the same? I told you, if you call the police I'll kill him. Fortunately, I found a fool to take the money for me. Haha, that idiot really thought she'd get 50-0 for herself. The kidnapper laughter was mixed with a hint of desperation. Since you won't give me the money, I'll take your dad down to the underworld with me anyway. My whole family is dead, so I'll let you taste what it's like to lose a loved one. He seemed almost delirious. If you surrender now, it's not too late, I said calmly, but he seemed to hear the biggest joke. Then it's not my fault. Open the door. I concealed my inner nervousness, straining my ears to listen for any movement on the other side. What his voice changed. Follow, by a loud bang. The door was broken down, and a series of hurried footsteps came through. The phone seemed to have fallen to the ground in the chaos. There were struggling, cursing voices, authoritative shouts, the sound of bodies scraping against the floor, and the clear clink of handcuffs, all mixed together. Thankfully, we got him, and thankfully, I hadn't been wrong when he made the first phone call. The police had already locked down his location to the area near my old seaside house, but now the place was a wasteland, dead fish and shrimp, no plant life. When my mother said go back to where you came from, I guessed it was our old house by the beach. so the police had already set up a perimeter around that area when I spoke with him again. I used the signal to help the police lock down his position. Where's my dad? How is he? I anxiously asked the police officer, my heart in turmoil. There was a lot of noise on the other end. And after a long pause, a low male voice came through. The victim is unconscious. The situation is critical. I saw my father at the hospital entrance. Since the task was carried out by the seaside, the police wore protective suits. To prevent nuclear contamination, my father was lying on a stretcher, his frail body covered with strange dark blue-black patches, and many of his legs were inflamed with ulcerated wounds. Most importantly, his whole body emitted a deep orange glow. The degree of nuclear contamination my father had suffered was at a moderate to high level, extremely dangerous. The stretcher was immediately pushed into the emergency room, and for safety reasons I was not allowed to accompany him. I went straight to the police station, where I found the defeated kidnapper and my weary mother. The kidnapper, I recognized him. His name was Ryan. He used to be a client of our family dealing in seafood. He occasionally visited our shallow sea breeding area to wholesale seafood, and more often it was my father who drove me to deliver goods to him in town. My mother usually handled deliveries to the town's restaurants and rarely stayed at the breeding area, so Ryan didn't know her. This time he was seeking revenge because his wife had suffered severe nuclear contamination. When she tried to get to the shelter, I stopped her at the entrance, and not long after she passed away, their child, only 10 months old, was forced to be weaned, which weakened his immunity. He caught a cold, and with the hospitals overcrowded, he couldn't get treatment in time. He developed pneumonia, which led to brain inflammation and event died. Simon, devastated, blamed everything on me. Once during casual conversation, my father had unintentionally mentioned our old house. Simon actually traced the information and found the village asking house by house. One night, he cornered my father while he was out in the yard, and my mother, who had been hiding in the cellar, narrowly escaped. The rumors of me being a reincarnator had spread widely online, and Simon was sure my father must have stockpiled a lot of supplies, so he forced him to give it all up. There was some water and food on the bed in the bedroom, and my father had no choice but to hand it over, hoping it would be enough to make Simon leave. But Simon wasn't satisfied. He wanted more. He wanted to kidnap my father and demand ransom from me to avoid drawing attention. He drove my father back to the coast. The so-called most dangerous places are the safest. Simon figured no one would dare to step onto the beach. What Simon didn't know was that as soon as he took my father, my mother quietly left the cellar, drove the small truck parked outside the village, and followed them to the shallow sea. Unfortunately, before she could call the police, Simon spotted her, but my mother quickly realized that Simon didn't recognize her. She pretended to be a coastal fisherman, busying herself in a neighbor's house near the breeding area. When Simon became suspicious and approached her, my mother caught a glimpse of my father bound and immediately slapped him twice. "You old fool, so you have your day too." After that, my mother excitedly grinned at Simon. "Brother, let me tell you, this guy is no good. He's been poisoning my breeding area just to steal business. Now with the world in chaos, don't you have a grudge against him too?" My mother pulled out a fish-filling knife, pretending to stab my father in the belly, which startled Simon. He hurriedly stopped her. "Hey, why are you stopping me? I'll kill him and throw him into the sea to feed the fish." Who would know? Simon's vigilance gradually faded as he proudly claimed the man was worth 2 million. My mother, however, scoffed at him. "He's overestimating things. By the time we're done, we'll both be handing over our own people handcuffed. Who's the fool who won't call the police? Then, by the way, his daughter is a good filial child, just a little stupid maybe. She really can buy his safety with money, but who would dare to bet on that?" Upon hearing this, Simon hatched a plan. He co-ed and bribed my mother to take the money to the rendezvous. That's how I ended up meeting my mother in South Village. Simon, still on high alert, monitored her actions through a video call, but I was still able to read her silent lip movements and understood the word home. There was no place safer than the police station. After my mother got into the police car, we all breathed a sigh of relief. Simon never anticipated that we could lock onto his position so quickly. Everything seemed to be going smoothly except for my father. I didn't understand why his nuclear contamination was so severe, because the day after you left, your father went out. He said he knew you wouldn't just hide away. He knew you were doing this for the country and the people. Your father and I didn't have much education, but we understood that the rise and fall of a nation is everyone's responsibility. We couldn't save more people, but we could still help the folks in the village. I fought back tears and listened as my mother recounted their story. I thought they would live a peaceful and low-profile life, but they didn't. After the nuclear contamination, spread. Countless people in the village died or fled inland. Originally a village with over 100 residents, only a few dozen remained. They hadn't stocked up on food in advance, and the village's crops and vegetables were all contaminated, wilted and yellowed, inedible. When my parents learned that the contamination had been controlled and reconstruction was underway, they took everything out of the cellar and only left a portion on the bed in the bedroom, giving the rest to the villagers. If Simon hadn't kidnapped my father, maybe my parents would have managed to hold on until I returned. But unfortunately, when Simon and dragged my father to the beach, he had no food. He was tied up with fishing nets next to the breeding area, only able to pick up some shellfish to survive. It was no surprise that he got contaminated. Luckily, he didn't consume much and it wasn't fatal. He was sent to the hospital in time for careful treatment, and his condition didn't worsen. Half a month later, my father woke up. Though his body was still weak, his mind was clearly intact. Having prepared for the worst, I was already relieved. Baby, you did well. My father's voice was weak, his eyes fixed on the special contribution medal in my hand, his gaze shining. Dad, Mom, you too, don't worry. The contamination has been controlled, and we'll rebuild our home in the mountain village. Everything will get better. I held my father with one hand and my mother with the other, watching as the orange-yellow glow around them gradually faded. In my heart, endless hope began to rise again. In this vast land, we will always face difficulties head-on. Living on endlessly, where there is government, there will always be a way out. That's all the story. What do you think of this story? Share with me in the comments section. What would you do if you were in this situation? Looking forward to hearing from you. If you like this story, don't forget to like it, share it, and subscribe to my channel. See you next time.